An elderly man on the brink of death made a last request to see his dog, Buddy. When the Labrador entered the hospital room, something miraculous happened. The patient's vital signs began to stabilize, and the dog's behavior revealed a crucial medical error. The terminal diagnosis was wrong. A story about connections that transcend explanation, unexpected healing, and a love that defies even science. Get ready to be moved. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. In the oppressive silence of room 412, only the rhythmic sound of machines broke the stillness. It was already night when John Smith, 78, opened his eyes after hours of restless sleep. His hands, once firm holding tools in the carpentry shop he kept for 5 decades, now trembled like autumn leaves. "Please," he whispered in a weak, almost inaudible voice, making his granddaughter Sarah lean closer to hear better. "I want to see Buddy one last time, just once." A solitary tear rolled down his wrinkled face, marked by time and stories that could fill volumes. Have you ever wondered what your last request would be if you knew your time was running out? For John, there was no doubt. It was to see his faithful 4-legged companion one more time before leaving. Buddy wasn't just a dog. The golden-coated Labrador with eyes as expressive as his owner's had been John's only constant companion since Elizabeth, his wife of 50 years, passed away. After a silent battle with cancer, 5 years had gone by, and on each of those days, Buddy was there, sitting at the feet of the rocking chair when John contemplated the garden Elizabeth loved so much, sleeping beside his bed on nights when loneliness seemed to weigh tons on his tired shoulders. The family gathered in the hospital hallway received the request with a mixture of understanding and embarrassment. How could they deny the last wish of a man whom doctors had sentenced to just a few days of life? But how could they convince the hospital administration to allow an animal into the facility? The rules were clear. Authorized persons only. "We can't just smuggle a Labrador into the hospital, Dad," argued Robert, John's eldest son, nervously running a hand through his graying hair. "There are rules, sanitary protocols." "Rules?" Mary's voice, John's daughter-in-law, cut through the air like a razor. The same woman who for years had a turbulent relationship with her stubborn father-in-law now became his fiercest defender. "We're talking about a dying man's last wish. What's worth more, a signed paper or the dignity of leaving in peace?" The corridors of that provincial hospital, with their faded green walls and the characteristic smell of antiseptic, had witnessed countless farewells. It was a place where the boundary between life and death became thin, where promises were made and often broken. But it was also a place where occasionally the improbable happened. That night, one of those almost mythical figures who exist in every hospital stepped in, Ms. Carmen, the head nurse who had served at that establishment for over 30 years. With her white hair always impeccably pinned in a bun, and a gaze that combined firmness and compassion, she was both feared and loved by the staff. As she passed the family group in evident conflict, she slowed her steps, catching fragments of the discussion. "What's going on here?" she asked with the authority of someone who knew every inch of that place. Sarah, the 22-year-old granddaughter who always had a special gift for storytelling, took the floor. She explained the situation, describing not only her grandfather's request but also Buddy's significance in his life, the deep loneliness that had accompanied him since her grandmother's death, and how the Labrador had been his only reason to keep going when depression consumed him. Carmen listened attentively without interrupting, her experienced eyes studying each face present. When Sarah finished, a heavy silence settled. The head nurse adjusted the stethoscope hanging around her neck, a gesture everyone had learned to recognize as her moment of reflection. "There are rules in this hospital," she began, making Robert sigh in discouragement. "But there is also compassion. And in my 34 years in the profession, I've learned that sometimes the latter must prevail over the former." Turning to the family, Ms. Carmen explained her plan. The hospital would have reduced movement during the shift change, around 6 in the morning. If they brought Buddy at this time, using the service entrance near the laundry, she would personally escort them to John's room. They would have 15 minutes, Not a second more for this last meeting. If anyone questions it, the responsibility will be entirely mine, she concluded, before walking away with quick, precise steps down the hallway. What the family didn't know was that, as she headed to her workstation, Ms. Carmen entered the small hospital chapel and lit a candle, following the local tradition of vows to Saint Benedict, an old belief that prayers made with true faith are always answered in some way. "Saint Benedict," she whispered, "do what is best for them." The early morning hours dragged on as if time itself wanted to prolong the anticipation of that meeting, while the rest of the family took turns in uncomfortable naps in the waiting room chairs. Sarah remained by her grandfather's side. She watched his chest rise and fall with difficulty, his skin yellowed by jaundice, a consequence of what doctors diagnosed as terminal pancreatic cancer, already with widespread metastasis. The same illness that had taken her grandmother. "Grandpa," she murmured, holding his cold, fragile hand between hers. "Buddy will come see you in the morning. Hang in there." A barely perceptible contraction in John's lips was the only indication that he had heard, but for Sarah, it was enough. Her grandfather, the man who had always been known for his legendary stubbornness, his refusal to accept help even when he needed it most, who preferred to spend hours trying to fix something alone rather than ask for help for 5 minutes, was there, fighting with the same determination that had characterized his entire life. The first lights of morning began to penetrate through the slats of the blinds when Robert entered the room, accompanied by Mary. Both looked exhausted, but there was a spark of determination in their eyes. "Everything's ready," Robert informed in a low voice. "Peter is with Buddy in the car, waiting for Miss Carmen's signal." Mary approached the bed, gently adjusting the sheet covering her father-in-law, a gesture of care that contrasted with years of tense relations, marked by heated arguments about how to raise the grandchildren, manage family finances, or take care of the house. It was no secret to anyone that John had never thought Mary was good enough for his son, an unfair judgment based more on his own insecurities than on his daughter-in-law's actual qualities. "Keep your eyes open, you stubborn old man," she murmured with surprising tenderness, lightly touching his bony shoulder. "Your friend is coming." Precisely at 6 o'clock, the room phone rang. A brief call without superfluous words. It was the agreed-upon signal. 10 minutes later, the soft sound of paws against the vinyl floor of the hallway announced the most awaited arrival. The door opened slowly, and Buddy entered, led by Peter, John's youngest grandson. The Labrador, normally active and playful, despite his 12 years, seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment. His brown eyes scanned the room quickly until they found the figure lying in bed. For a moment, the dog hesitated, as if he didn't fully recognize that fragile version of his owner. "Go on, boy," Peter encouraged, loosening the leash. "It's Grandpa." Buddy advanced cautiously, his snout sniffing the air, catching the strange odors of medications and antiseptics mixed with the familiar scent of his owner. As he approached the bed, something unexpected happened. Instead of jumping or barking in enthusiastic recognition as everyone expected, the Labrador lay down calmly beside the bed, positioning his head so it was close to John's dangling hand. The silence in the room was almost palpable, broken only by the constant sound of the monitors. Then, as if waking from a long sleep, John's fingers moved slightly, finding the top of Buddy's head. A deep sigh escaped his dry lips. "My good boy," he whispered, his voice firmer than it had been in days. "You came." It was at this exact moment that Dr. Patricia Miller, the doctor in charge of the case, entered the room for the morning evaluation. Her look of surprise at seeing the animal quickly turned into professional interest when she noticed something on the monitors tracking John's vital signs. "Please, don't worry," she said upon seeing the panic in the family's eyes. "I won't ask you to remove the dog. In fact," she approached the monitors, adjusting her thin-rimmed glasses. "This is fascinating." John's vital signs, which had been progressively deteriorating in recent days, now showed a subtle but undeniable improvement. His blood pressure was more stabilized, his heart rate less erratic, and his oxygen saturation had increased by a few points. While the doctor examined the data with growing interest, Buddy began to display peculiar behavior. The Labrador, still lying near the bed, stretched his neck and began to sniff John's chest insistently, specifically the right side, near the liver. His snout gently pressed the area, as if trying to communicate something. Peter, who had always had a special connection with animals and considered a career in veterinary medicine, was the first to notice. "He's trying to show something," he commented, pointing to the dog's behavior. "See how he keeps insisting on the same spot." Initially, the comment was met with complacent smiles, the family attributing the behavior to missing his owner or some random canine instinct. However, Dr. Miller, trained at a university known for integrative medical approaches, observed the scene with increasing curiosity. The 15 minutes agreed upon with Ms. Carmen quickly ran out. When the head nurse returned to indicate it was time to leave, something unexpected happened. Buddy, the gentle Labrador who had never shown any aggressive behavior, refused to move. When Peter tried to pull him by the leash, the dog emitted a low defensive growl, positioning himself even closer to the bed. The family was perplexed. This was not typical behavior for Buddy, known for his docility and obedience. Embarrassed and fearful of causing problems for Ms. Carmen, who had already risked her position by allowing the visit, they tried again to remove the animal, now with Robert joining the effort. That's when Dr. Miller, who had been observing everything with clinical interest, made a surprising intervention. "Let him stay a little longer," she requested to everyone's astonishment. "Something is happening here that deserves our attention." Turning to Ms. Carmen, the doctor explained that she intended to perform some additional tests immediately, and that the dog's presence might be relevant to her observations. The head nurse, despite her evident concern about protocols, nodded. In her long years in the profession, she had learned to trust the instincts of good doctors. 30 minutes, she conceded, adjusting her wristwatch. Not a second more. During the next half hour, room 412 turned into a stage for one of the most extraordinary episodes in that provincial hospital. Dr. Miller, assisted by a newly arrived resident, performed a series of physical exams on John, focusing particularly on the area that so intrigued Buddy. With each touch, each pressure applied, the dog's behavior changed subtly, growling when the pressure seemed to cause John discomfort, relaxing when the doctor moved away. "It's like he's guiding us," Dr. Miller murmured, more to herself than to those present. At the end of that unusual examination session, the doctor requested a battery of new tests, including specific blood tests and a targeted ultrasound. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope mixed with scientific doubt, that did not escape the family's notice. "I'll need you to take Buddy now," she said finally. "But I'd like to talk to all of you after the results of these tests are in." The next 2 hours were filled with tense waiting in the hallway. Buddy, finally persuaded to leave the room with the promise that he would return, was taken home by Peter. The rest of the family waited, each dealing with the anxiety in their own way. Robert pacing back and forth, Mary biting her already worn nails, Sarah lost in silent prayers. When Dr. Miller finally appeared, her demeanor was serious, but not in the devastating way everyone feared. Leading them to a small meeting room at the end of the hall, she closed the door and took a deep breath before beginning to speak. "What I'm about to say might sound confusing, perhaps even improbable," she began, adjusting her glasses in a nervous gesture. "But the preliminary results of the new tests suggest that there may have been inaccuracies in Mr. Smith's initial diagnosis." Robert was the first to react, leaning forward in his chair with his eyes fixed on the doctor. "What exactly does that mean, doctor?" "It means," she chose her words carefully, "that your father's condition may not be terminal pancreatic cancer as we initially diagnosed. We are now considering the possibility of a combination of treatable problems that, due to family history and some overlapping symptoms, were mistakenly interpreted as malignant." The silence that followed was dense, charged with contradictory emotions, hope, distrust, confusion. Mary was the one who broke it, her sharp voice reflecting years of accumulated frustration. "Are you telling us that my father-in-law was wrongly diagnosed with a terminal illness? That we spent the last Few months believing he was dying because of a mistake. The doctor did not back down from the implicit accusation. Medicine is not an exact science, Ms. Smith. We work with probabilities, evidence, previous experience. The initial diagnosis was based on tests that indicated a specific clinical picture consistent with the patient's family history. So what changed? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with contained emotion. The dog, the doctor replied simply. Buddy's behavior led us to investigate a specific area that hadn't received enough attention in our initial exams. And what we found was something rarely diagnosed, an autoimmune liver condition that, when properly treated, can reverse many of the severe symptoms your grandfather is experiencing. The technical explanation that followed largely went unnoticed by the family, stunned by the news. Words like serological markers, immunosuppressive, treatment, and favorable prognosis floated in the air, caught fragmentarily. It was Robert who finally brought the conversation back to the central issue. Are you telling us my father can live? Dr. Miller allowed herself a discreet smile. I'm saying there's a real possibility of treatment. I can't promise a complete cure. Mr. Smith's age and his overall debilitated state are complicating factors. But yes, with proper treatment, we have reason to believe he could have more time, and with significantly better quality of life. Upon returning to the room, they found John awake, with a lucidity he hadn't shown in weeks. When they explained what had happened, he listened, in silence, his wrinkled face impassive. Only when they mentioned Buddy's crucial role in the whole process did a tear roll from the corner of his eye. I always knew he was special, he murmured, looking out the window where the morning sun now shone brightly. Elizabeth said he had a gift. In the following weeks, a new treatment plan was implemented. With each small progress, the family celebrated quietly, fearful of fueling excessive hopes. John, for his part, showed surprising determination for someone who had recently been preparing to die. He strictly followed all medical instructions, he who had always been the epitome of the difficult patient. Each pill brings me closer to home, he explained when asked about his sudden obedience. To Buddy, taking advantage of the inexplicable success of that first visit, Dr. Miller managed to get special authorization from the hospital board for Buddy to visit regularly as part of an experimental animal-assisted therapy program. These visits quickly became the highlight of John's weeks, moments when the nurses noted visible improvements in his vital signs and state of mind. It was during one of these visits, at the end of the first month of treatment, that a new character entered that already extraordinary story. David Wilson, a young veterinarian newly established in the region, heard about the case through the small town's growing network of rumors. Intrigued by the reports of Buddy's diagnostic behavior, he decided to visit the hospital. Introducing himself to the family, he explained his professional interest in the case, asking permission to observe Buddy during one of the visits. What he noticed, however, was something completely unexpected. Did you notice that Buddy seems to be experiencing some discomfort? He asked, after observing the Labrador for a few minutes. The family, so focused on John's surprising recovery, admitted they hadn't noticed anything different in the dog's behavior. David then pointed to subtle signs, his slightly more labored breathing, the way the animal occasionally lay favoring a specific side, the decrease in the enthusiasm he normally showed. With the family's permission, the veterinarian performed a preliminary examination on the Labrador right there. His expression gradually became more serious as he palpated different parts of the animal's body, paying particular attention to the chest. I believe Buddy might have an undiagnosed heart problem, he informed, concern evident in his voice. It would be important to run some more detailed tests to confirm, but I'm detecting arrhythmia and possibly a murmur. The irony of the situation did not escape anyone. The dog who had helped save his owner also needed saving. The news fell like a weight on the family, especially on John, who absorbed the information with an expression of deep sadness. How much will the treatment cost? Robert asked, already mentally calculating the family's resources, already committed to the hospital expenses. David was honest. Treatment for heart conditions in elderly animals was neither simple nor cheap. It would involve continuous medication, possibly specialized procedures, and constant monitoring. It was at this moment that Sarah, always the most connected to the local community through her work as a teacher, had an inspiration. "Our town has always been proud of how we take care of each other," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "Let's organize a campaign to help Buddy. I'm sure many people would like to give back for what he did for Grandpa." The idea, initially met with moderate skepticism by Robert and Mary, quickly took on a life of its own when Sarah began sharing the story on social media and with her students. The narrative of the dog who diagnosed a condition doctors had missed, potentially saving his elderly owner, captured the collective imagination of the small community. In less than a week, what started as a simple online fundraiser turned into a community movement. The Save Buddy campaign spread through the town like a benevolent wildfire. Local stores placed donation boxes near their cash registers. The corner bakery created bone-shaped cookies with part of the profits going to the treatment, and the school where Sarah taught organized a charity fair themed around the relationship between humans and animals. The phenomenon did not go unnoticed by the regional media. A reporter from the newspaper from the neighboring capital city, enchanted by the story, produced a full-page article titled, "The Dog Who Diagnosed the Unthinkable." The report not only recounted the extraordinary facts of the case, but also included interviews with experts, discussing the growing field of study on dogs' ability to detect diseases in humans. While the community mobilized around Buddy, John continued his slow but steady recovery. The treatment for his autoimmune condition was exhausting. Plasmapheresis sessions, immunosuppressive medication, constant monitoring of his liver function. But for the first time in months, there was color returning to his face, strength in his voice, and most importantly, the will to live that seemed to have abandoned the old carpenter. In the third month of treatment, coinciding with the traditional town festival dedicated to animals and their spiritual connection with humans, a local tradition dating back to the community's rural origins, the family was surprised with a special invitation. Father James, a respected figure in the community, not only for his religious role but for his history of social work, requested that John and Buddy be the guests of honor at the festival's central ceremony, the annual blessing of the animals in the main churchyard. "It would be important for our community," the priest explained during his visit to the hospital. "Your story reminds us of the deep connection that can exist between humans and animals, something our ancestors always knew, and that modern science is only beginning to rediscover." Although still hospitalized, John received medical permission for a brief outing, provided he was accompanied by a healthcare professional. On the day of the festival, leaning on a cane and Robert's steady arm, he was transported to the church in a wheelchair. Buddy, now also medicated for his heart condition, walked calmly by his side, as if understanding the solemnity of the occasion. The central square was decorated with colorful ribbons and wildflowers. Children ran with their pets, dogs of all breeds and sizes, reluctant cats on decorative leashes, even a dwarf goat belonging to the baker's family. Elders sat on wooden benches sharing stories about the animals that had marked their long lives. When John and Buddy arrived, a respectful silence momentarily settled, followed by spontaneous applause. The old carpenter, visibly moved, waved shyly to the people who approached to greet him, many bringing small tokens: a homemade cookie for Buddy, a handmade card from the school children, a bouquet of wildflowers picked that morning. During the ceremony, Father James presented John with a medal of St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of animals. "To remember that sometimes angels come on four paws," he explained as he placed the silver medal in the elderly man's trembling hands. Buddy received a special blessing, following a centuries-old tradition in the region, where it was believed that animals blessed at this specific festival received extra protection against diseases and dangers. The Labrador, as if understanding the ritual, remained exceptionally quiet while the priest sprinkled a few drops of holy water on his golden head. Returning to the hospital that night, John seemed transformed by the experience. For the first time since the start of his illness, he spoke openly about the future, plans to renovate the small shed behind his house, turning it into a smaller workshop where he could resume woodworking as a hobby. Adaptations he wanted to make to his home to facilitate his reduced mobility. Even a trip he had always dreamed of taking with Elizabeth to the California coast, which he now thought of doing. With the family, the 5th month brought the news everyone was eagerly awaiting. John would be discharged from the hospital. His condition, though still requiring continuous care and regular monitoring, was stable enough for him to continue treatment at home. Dr. Miller, as she handed over the discharge papers and the extensive list of recommendations and medications, made a point of sharing something she had been keeping. "I've studied your case with colleagues from across the country, Mr. Smith," she explained, sitting on the edge of the bed that would soon be vacated. Buddy's behavior wasn't a coincidence. There are preliminary studies on dogs that can detect chemical changes in the human body, indicating diseases even before they manifest. Clinically detectable symptoms. Your case will be included in a research project we're starting on this phenomenon. The return home was marked by a warm reception organized by the neighbors. The gate decorated with balloons, a welcome banner, stretched across the front of the house, a table with simple treats prepared with evident affection. Buddy, who was waiting anxiously in the garden, was the first to greet John, jumping happily despite his own heart condition, barking with renewed enthusiasm upon seeing his human finally returning home. But the initial euphoria soon gave way to new challenges. John, accustomed to a life of absolute independence, now found himself limited by his reduced mobility, the constant fatigue that accompanied his condition, and the need for help with tasks he previously performed without thinking: bathing, dressing, preparing his own meals. For a man who had built his identity around self-sufficiency, this new reality was often harder to accept than the idea of death that had hovered over him months earlier. "I'd rather die than be a burden," he would grumble on nights when the frustration became unbearable. Equally challenging was the new routine of caring for Buddy. The Labrador, now also medicated, needed special attention, a controlled diet, limited exercise, medication at precise times. John, who had always been the dog's primary caregiver, now could barely open the medication bottles with fingers stiffened by arthritis and weakened by the long hospitalization. It was in this setting of difficult adjustments that the most improbable reinforcement arrived. Helen, John's eldest daughter, who lived in another state and had maintained minimal contact with the family for years due to old disagreements related to the inheritance left by Elizabeth, surprised everyone by showing up unannounced on a rainy Sunday morning. "I came to help," she announced simply, placing her suitcases in the hallway as if she had never left. Her gaze avoided her father's, focusing instead on the Labrador who was sniffing her curiously, not fully recognizing her after so many years. Only later, in a private conversation with Sarah, would Helen reveal her true motivation. It wasn't just the news about her father's health that brought her back, but specifically the mentions of Buddy and occasional calls with her brother. The Labrador had been chosen by her as a gift for her parents after John's retirement, an attempt to fill the void her own absence had left. When she learned of the crucial role the animal had played in her father's medical turnaround, she felt it was a sign, a second chance for long-delayed reconciliations. The forced cohabitation reignited old conflicts. John, with his characteristic stubbornness, resisted Helen's attempts to organize the house and his medical routine. Helen, in turn, carried years of unresolved grievances, which emerged at the most unexpected moments. Upon finding an old family photograph from which she had been cut out, upon realizing her childhood room had been turned into a storage room, upon noticing her name was rarely mentioned in family conversations. During a particularly tense afternoon, when father and daughter were arguing heatedly about past decisions, John accusing Helen of abandonment, she retorting about years of favoritism directed at Robert, something extraordinary happened. Buddy, normally calm during family disputes, suddenly positioned himself between the two, barking insistently, alternating glances between them as if reprimanding them. The behavior was so unusual, so deliberate in its intent, that father and daughter stopped arguing, surprised. For a moment they just stared at the Labrador, who remained in his mediating position, breathing heavily due to the unusual effort for his weakened heart. "I guess he's telling us to stop acting like kids," Helen finally commented, a reluctant smile appearing at the corner of her lips. John didn't respond immediately. He watched the dog with a complex expression, part admiration, part shame. "He was always wiser than us," he finally murmured. This mediating behavior of Buddy became frequent in the following weeks, as if the animal understood the importance of family reconciliation for his owner's complete well-being. Whenever voices were raised, there he was, interposing himself physically or drawing attention with short, determined barks. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic between father and daughter began to change. Conversations, previously limited to the practical aspects of daily care, slowly expanded to include shared memories, updates on Helen's life in another city, and eventually, the deeper issues that had caused the initial estrangement. In the 7th month after that fateful day at the hospital, when John had asked to see Buddy one last time, a setback scared the newly reconciled family. During a walk in the garden, longer than recommended by the doctors, the elderly man fell. It wasn't serious. No broken bones, just some bruises and a considerable scare, but enough to cause a temporary relapse in his condition. Confined to bed again for a few days, John went through a period of somber introspection. The fall, a direct consequence of his insistence on doing more than his body allowed, served as a harsh reminder of the limitations imposed by age and illness. It was during this period that he finally verbalized what was perhaps the core of his internal struggles throughout his life. "I need to accept that needing help doesn't make me less of a person," he confessed one night to Helen, who was keeping him company in his room while organizing the many medications. "I spent my whole life thinking that depending on others was a weakness. Maybe the real mistake was not realizing that we are all interdependent." It was a simple but profoundly significant admission for a man who had built his entire identity around self-sufficiency. Helen, recognizing the weight of those words, simply held her father's hand, a gesture of connection worth more than any verbal response. In the 8th month after the initial diagnosis, unexpected news arrived through Ms. Carmen, who had kept in touch with the family. The provincial hospital, directly inspired by the extraordinary story of John and Buddy, would officially inaugurate a permanent animal-assisted therapy program. The head nurse, now elevated to the position of coordinator of the new department, insisted that both man and dog be the special guests of the inauguration ceremony. The occasion, organized with the characteristic simplicity of community events in that region, brought together healthcare professionals, patients who had benefited from already initiated pilot projects, and representatives from the local community. John, still using a cane but visibly stronger than in previous months, attended accompanied by his entire family, including Helen, who had decided to extend her initially temporary stay. Buddy, sporting a specially made blue bandana for the occasion, walked proudly beside his human. His heart condition stabilized thanks to the treatment funded by community generosity. Occasionally, he stopped to receive a pet or accept a treat offered by an admirer. His local fame now solidly established as the dog who diagnosed the unthinkable. During the small ceremony, after the official speeches and the traditional ribbon-cutting, Peter, the grandson who had always shown special interest in Buddy, asked to make a personal announcement. With the organizer's permission, the 19-year-old positioned himself before those present, visibly nervous but determined. "Many of you know I was about to start law school next semester," he began, his voice gaining firmness as he spoke. "That was always the plan. Follow in my father's footsteps, eventually join the family firm. But in the last few months, I've witnessed something that has profoundly changed my perspective on what I want to do with my life." Looking directly at his grandfather and Buddy, seated in the front row, Peter announced his decision. He had decided to change his academic path, abandoning corporate law to study veterinary medicine. "My grandfather and Buddy taught me that the deepest connections transcend words," he explained, emotion evident in his youthful voice. "I want to dedicate my life to understanding and strengthening these bonds between humans and animals, especially when they can save lives." Robert, initially silent in the face of the unexpected announcement, was the first to stand up and hug his son, a gesture that surprised both Peter and the family members, who knew the rigidity with which the lawyer traditionally handled career matters. The story that began with a last request, to see Buddy one more time before leaving, had transformed into a multifaceted new beginning. For John, who now enjoyed each day with his faithful companion, aware that both were living on borrowed time, granted by extraordinary circumstances. For Helen, who had found a way back to her family roots. For Peter, who had discovered his true calling. For the local community, which had witnessed the transformative power of the connection between a man and his dog. As he watched his grandson being congratulated by those present, John leaned down to stroke Buddy's head, which rested calmly beside his chair. "You always knew, didn't you?" he whispered into the Labrador's attentive ear, "that we still had stories to live together." Buddy, as if perfectly understanding the words, lifted his gaze to his human, his brown eyes filled with that ancestral wisdom that only the best friends of man seem to possess. In that silent look resided a truth that everyone there had learned in the most extraordinary way, that sometimes the most powerful medicine doesn't come in bottles, but on four paws and with a loyal heart.